You said that the number of pump outs meet the USBA's, at least their minimum or some threshold.
Yeah.
What is ecology looking at as a, maybe to beat that up?
Yeah, I
beyond
mean,
that?
it's
Because
about,
the minimum's really not quite enough.
we're at about 2 to 6 times higher than that criteria already.
Already?
Yes,
Okay.
for recreational. The commercial's looked at a little differently because a lot of those commercial vessels have that holding capacity, can go out to sea, so it's not a direct correlation. But on the recreational, they actually have a number guidance on that. And so yeah, we're, depending on how you look at vessel numbers, it's between 2 and 6 times higher than that criteria. But you also have to look at location, so we looked at that as well. It's not just the numbers, but where are they?
Yeah, because it's a big difference whether you're going dock to dock,
Yeah.
which a lot of power boaters do,
Yeah.
or sailboaters that might go out for weeks on end
Yeah.
with nothing available.
Exactly. We've certainly tried to take all of that into account.
Point of clarification though, from the beginning you said that no, you can't technically discharge right now unless you're 3 miles out.
If you can't discharge with, so if you're more than 3 miles out, you can discharge untreated. So within, it's already, you're right, not required, or, so within 3 miles, you have to have a type 1 or a type 2 system to be able to discharge.
Okay.
So yes, the untreated sewage is already not allowed. Not to say that that always happens. But the treated is what we're also concerned about, is that even with those treatment standards, it's not being protected enough.
So ultimately the goal is that, one, bringing those treated systems into the fold, and then also
Yes.
to allow
And
for
also
the greater enforcement by having the
amp up
local levels.
hopefully amp up more of the pump outs being used. Question over here.
What was the reason for not sticking with the 3 miles, since that's a fairly standard state jurisdiction?
Oh, for on that map where we go a little further than 3 miles?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Let me just pull that up so it's easier to talk about when you can look at it. So this area up here, there's an area in here that you're more than 3 miles from shore. And that is in line with our definition, the state definition, our constitution of marine waters, inland marine waters. So those are state waters. And that area, as you know, discharges would move throughout that water body, so we wanted to be protective of the resources and sensitive water bodies up in this area as well. And then it's also makes it for ease of understanding where that zone is. Does that help?
Well, I mean, it's,
The
the
federal
standard
government-
definition of a state jurisdiction is 3 miles.
No,
So
the
you're-
federal standard is 3 miles with the exception of inland marine waters,
Okay,
where you can, there are areas you can be more than 3 miles, and so under the
Right.
federal government where that's
so there's
still.
an ambiguity there which will require
EPA will have to.
constant
Yeah.
explaining, because
Yeah.
most people look at the 3 mile line on their charts, I'm in federal waters, I'm in state waters.
Yeah.
So that will need a lot of explaining.
And that can certainly be part of our outreach and education, trying to describe exactly where that line is, and making sure it's charted out for people to understand that. You're right, there is certainly a certain understanding out there of this 3 mile idea, but that's not exactly in line with where our boundaries actually are. So we want to try to be as protective as we can.
So, folks are going to need to get holding tanks,
Yes.
and then if they already have a holding tank, do they have to change their system somewhat so that you actually can't discharge, or
No,
none of
I mean
that?
typically if you have a holding tank on board, you have a Y valve, so just
Right.
making sure that Y valve is closed. Some states have done, double checking of that as part of their enforcement. They might put like a dye tab in the toilet to make sure that that Y valve is closed. And again, those concepts haven't been 100% ironed out until you get to that stage of the process. But those are some of the ideas to assure it. But as long as you have that Y valve closed and you're not discharging, then you're in compliance. You don't need to make any additional changes to your holding tank if you have a holding tank. So if you have a holding tank, of course you do want to make sure it's sufficient. If you normally have 1 person on the boat and you have 30 one day, making sure your holding tank is going to be sufficient, or maybe you need to make more frequent or earlier stop for a pump out station.
Okay, and then I had two other questions. One, you're having problems with the tug is a problem because of all the expensive retrofits. The cruise ships how has that been?
Yeah, there's kind of a couple different categories of cruise ships. Your large cruise ships, your Carnival and Royal
Yeah.
Caribbean, and all those ones. Those ones all have holding capacity, and they have been holding for years.
Okay.
They can hold until they're up in Canada and out to sea, west of Canada, out there.
Yeah.
So that's what they typically hold until they're out there. And so they have that holding capacity. These small to medium overnight passengers, so like your Lindblad or uncruised ones, we've been meeting with them to talk about the logistics of their systems too, and their retrofits are going to be substantial. So we've been meeting with them trying to figure out the logistics of that. The smaller kind of cruise ships that are more like your day trips, or Victoria Clippers or Argosies, those already use holding tanks and pump out stations.
Okay. And then what about any foreign flag vessels? Is this gonna?
It applies to any vessel that comes to the area, whether they're foreign flag or not.
And so how's that communication gonna happen? That
Yeah, well,
seems
we work,
difficult.
what typically happens in other locations, like the northeast part of the country has this, so it's a very common thing there as well, is you typically work with the associations and the groups to let them know. They look at their maps, okay, there's a no discharge zone when they go into California, okay, now there's one up here. So really adding that to their maps, making sure that that's clear, that as they come into this area, here's where the no discharge zone is.
I have two questions. What do most pump out stations do with what they
Oh,
pumped out?
that's a great question. What do they do with all that sewage they collect?
Yeah.
Yeah, that all goes to
Kind of put it
land-based
back out at
systems.
night.
No, it doesn't just go right into it. It's certainly not supposed to. Better not be. No, part of the petition process is you actually have to show for each pump out station where does that waste go to. And it can either go to a land-based system that might discharge either to surface water and a stationary outfall where there's a closure zone. Or it could go to a drainage field if it has kind of a smaller system, so not discharged directly to surface water. So you do have to show that for each of those pump out stations where it goes to.
Do the big marinas typically go into their sanitary sewer
Yeah, some of
system?
them have a direct connection into, most of the bigger ones have a direct connection into their, like directly into like the King County line that'll go to those big treatment systems. Some of them will use pumper trucks to take that to a land-based system. It really kind of depends on the location of that. But we do have to confirm that does get treated properly and meets our water quality to a system that can meet our water quality standards.
The other question is, you had some earlier slides that show kind of the problems in the sound that this process
Yeah.
could help with, and it strikes me that most of those problems have far greater contributors possibly
There are
than...
definitely a lot other volume contributors. So what we see with vessels is the risk. Like King County has combined sewer overflows that we see a lot in the news. Is these big discharges from King County. Those are from fixed locations. With vessels, while the volumes aren't as big as that, we're concerned with where they're discharging. That they're in these sensitive water bodies. Can be directly over a shellfish bed, where those fixed locations from those combined sewer overflows don't have shellfish in the area. They're not allowed.
What I'm wondering is if you're getting a lot of pushback from people who say, oh, you're just throwing money over a spit in a bucket, you ought to go...
Yeah, and again, we're
fix
trying
ours or
to,
something.
we're working to address all those different pollution sources, and they all have different price tags. Your combined sewer overflows obviously is going to be a big price tag. Stormwater is a big price tag overall. Cities are spending a lot of money on that as well. And again, there's a lot of different characteristics or pollution sources that are being.
Well, it seems like kind of a no-brainer, but is the pushback very heavy or pretty good?
It's mixed. I mean, yeah, that certainly is brought up, and we just, want to focus on preventing that risk. And this is one of those sources that we can do a lot to prevent. And again, a lot of the money has already been spent as far as like the recreational pump outs and people already putting the holding tanks in. It's about improving what's really already out there. Did I miss anything? He's kind of the broader picture person.
Well, no, I mean, Pete, you know that obviously, like the sandwich, we've been working on other sources for a long time, and you said it's kind of a no-brainer. I guess the best analogy that we can think of is a faulty septic system. I mean, people don't question if there's a faulty septic system. You got to get it fixed because you can prevent it. You don't have to go out and do some elaborate study. Does that faulty septic system, is it affecting that shellfish bed downstream? And the sandwich, we're looking at them all, and if it's faulty, fix it. So this is really, if we have the ability to prevent this type of pollution, shouldn't we do it? Now, you mentioned pushback there, up until about, a month or so ago, most of the push was like, ecology, when are you gonna do this? Now, as this begins, as we go to submit a draft petition, it starts to get real for some folks, and those folks that it might affect most, started to get concerned about this, and some of those are as we talk about with tugs and some of the small commercials, this is a real issue, and so we've already got the extension for them. Is that long enough, or what else can we do about that? Are there the proper, so that's a very real discussion we need to have. But given that upwards of 90%, 95% of both commercial and recreational already have the capacity to comply, doesn't it make sense to kind of move? That's kind of, as a water quality agency, that's what we're moving toward, but it doesn't mean it's a fait accompli. I mean, we still got to go through the process. We have to do the documentation. We have to address these concerns from the commercials that are real. Some of the small cruise ships that are just, if you stop and think about it, 100 people drinking on a ship for a limited period of time. Okay, you really got room for that holding tank type of thing. So there are some real, that's the minority, but it's an important minority that we got to figure out.
Let's take that one.
Once this is implemented, how do you enforce it?
Yeah, how do we enforce it? There's different strategies out there. There's the fines that we had talked about, but the main piece of it is that outreach and education. So that would be the main focus, and especially initially, making sure people know about it. But the enforcement, it could be done through like Fish and Wildlife that's already out there doing boardings and looking at other elements, safety, and how many fish they've caught, and all those different things. So there could be some cross-training to add this element to that, so you're not adding yet another inspection or boarding. So they could potentially have that enforcement authority, but that has to, as I mentioned, go through kind of a legislative process to obtain those authorities in the right places.
Yeah. And I'm not a boater, but do vessels have to get registered every year or two, just like cars do?
They got their registration process, and you guys would probably know better than me how frequent that is. I don't know how often you have to go.
It's every year.
Every year, is it? Okay.
But there's no inspection involved.
Right, that's just a paperwork, like our driver's license kind of thing. So
That
that's,
may be proof that you have the proper,
yeah. There is a boater education that you have to go through, and that's not every year, I know, where you go through basically you take a test, the education, and the test on that. So, and those are some of the things we're planning on building off of. So with your registration, there could be information about the no discharge zone, so people know about it.
right,
Or even questions that relate to where this is.
So can,
I'll get to you next time.
excuse me, can Fish and Wildlife board without essential cause, like the Coast Guard can?
We've been starting to have some discussions with all the different agencies involved, with some of the recreational boaters have had questions about that. And I'm not an expert on what their authorities are and how they can do that. They'd be better to answer that.
The Coast Guard can, they can say, we're
Coast Guard
gonna
can board, as I understand, pretty much for any reason, but I'm not positive about Fish and Wildlife.